Let me go straight into an example. Tax. Now in the UK, most people pay their taxes on time because we have criminal sanctions if you don't, financial disincentives, penalties, and plenty of information campaigns to make you aware of when you need to pay your tax. But still, a sizable minority of people don't pay their taxes on time. Now, a traditional approach might be to think, okay, so let's increase the sanction. Let's threaten people more. Let's fine people more. A behavioural approach is different. Now, when you haven't paid your taxes in the UK, you get a letter from the tax office which says, you haven't paid, please can you pay? A behavioural approach might be to think, what are our other levers? So we know from a range of different experiments that actually social pressure is very powerful. We know that people seek social approval. In fact, lack of social approval shows up as pain in the brain. In brain scans, it shows up as pain. So how can we use this? We adapted one thing in the behavioural letter, contrasted to the original letter, which was sent by the tax office, and we added this line, which is true, by the way. 9 out of 10 people pay their tax on time. You are one of the few people who hasn't. Okay, is this loud enough? No. Tell me if it needs to be louder. Okay, all right. So when we trial this, and we measure how much tax is paid as a result, we find that the initial letter, this amount of people pay, 33.6%. But when we just add that single line, when we say most people have already paid, you're one of the few people that hasn't, we get a significant increase by 2 percentage points. When we then say, actually, how can we make this even more powerful? 9 out of 10 people in your town have already paid. You're one of the few people that haven't. Another increase. 9 out of 10 people with a debt like yours have already paid. Another increase. And finally, by combining the location and the debt like yours, 9 out of 10 people in your town with a debt like yours have already paid your tax. You're one of the few people that haven't. That increases tax payment by 6 percentage points. That's a huge increase. Now, we've done several of these trials, and I can just give you this figure for a start. Over the last 12 months, we brought forward an additional 270 million euros of tax at almost no extra cost, because we're just changing letters. So my first point is these small details are really powerful. Who would have thought previously, maybe we should write the letter in a slightly different way, telling people about the behavior of other people? Actually, it's one of the most powerful tools we have. So we need to start thinking differently about our behavior. And a very clever man called Daniel Kahneman, do you guys know him? I'm sure a couple of you, a few people nodding, we're good. He talks about 2 systems of thought within the brain, right? So we have our system 1, which is our automatic system. So if I say, what's 2 times 2? You think 4. It's intuitive, it's immediate. You don't need to process it. It's not effortful. Then we have system 2, which is more calculative and reflective. So if you think about what you're going to choose from a menu, or if I say, what's 17 times 24? It requires effort. Most of you won't bother working that out. Maybe one or two will. So there are 2 ways of thinking. But what Mr. Kahneman said, Professor Kahneman, was that actually many more of our actions are governed by the automatic system, our system 1, than we previously thought. So that then suggests the question, what influences our first system of thinking, our system 1? The environmental choices that we have, the cues that we take from the way other people behave, the way choices are presented to us, are far more powerful than we thought. I'm going to play a game to demonstrate with you, okay? It's called Spot the Suspect. You need to watch. I'm going to show you 3 suspects very quickly, because in real life, if you're in a situation and you spot a crime, you don't have a good time to, study the suspect. Are you ready? Okay. Suspect 1, suspect 2, suspect 3. Now I'm going to ask you if you can see a suspect. Similarly, like you may have seen on US crime dramas, when they pick a suspect, they have people line up an eyewitness parade. Actually, in the UK, we do things by video now, but nevertheless, the point remains. Tell me, can you see a suspect? Hands up if you can see a suspect. Okay. Can you see a suspect? Okay. What about now? So actually, the suspect here is on the left. There's no suspect there. But the reason people put their hands up is that they compared their remembrance of the suspect to this man. And this man looks more like the real suspect than this man. So because you presented them like that, you're changing the way people decide and the way people think. Now let me show you a trial. When this was trialed, and people were presented with the information just as you were, over a quarter of people picked the wrong suspect when they were given the choice of people standing side by side. Just changing the design a little bit. So rather than presenting suspects side by side, you present them sequentially, one by one. That's surely no different cost to the administrator. Look at the result. You lower the error rate to 9% just by changing a small element of the design. So that's what behavioral science is all about. But because it's fun, here are some more examples. All right, some of you must be familiar with this. Now, in some countries, organ donation is a presumed thing. So, for example, in this country, Portugal, and in Sweden, and France, it is presumed that you will donate your organs on pain of death. But in countries where it's presumed that you won't, you have to opt in and you have to say, I will do this, I will carry a donor card. In other countries, you have to say, I don't want to do this, I won't, and look at the result. In countries where you have to opt out, where you have to say, I don't want to do this, you have 96, 97% consent rates. In countries where you have to opt in, you've got much, much lower. It's not because there's an inherent difference in the attitudes of these people in these countries. It's about the way the choice is presented. Here are two identical situations, in Holland, actually. There are 80 to 100 bicycles lined up. They're chained. In each bicycle, the experimenters have placed a flyer. No one wants a flyer in their bicycle basket, right? The temptation is to throw it away. It's a nuisance. But you're aware of a social norm, an understanding of how most people behave in certain situations. And that is, don't litter, it's bad, right? One difference between the two situations. There's a social norm that's been broken. There's graffiti on one of the walls, even though it says no graffiti. What's interesting is that the experimenters measured whether or not people were more likely or less likely to litter. And you'll find that more than twice as many people littered when there was graffiti. This isn't a one-off. The experimenter, Dr. Kees Keizer, repeated this 6 times. I'll pick out one other. A €5 note hanging out of a postbox, 3 postboxes, a plain postbox, a postbox with litter around it, and a postbox with graffiti around it. Again, twice the number of people stole the money when a social norm had been violated, i.e. there was litter or there was graffiti. More relevant to the concern of these lectures, experimenters in Kenya trialed different approaches to encourage people to use chlorine to make their water safe to drink. You guys know this one. Now, in addition to moves such as making the chlorine free and various other marketing campaigns, the most effective activity was actually to place the chlorine dispenser in the communal well where people went to get their water. Thus, it made it timely. It was the right time for someone to go and get the water. It was easy to do, but more importantly, if someone did it, other people could see them doing it. So it creates a sense of social norm. Actually, now there is social approval for doing this thing, and the results were spectacular. So those are kind of everyday life decisions, right? But what about decisions you're really actually having to think about? Has anyone been in a jury? Do you know what jury is? Jurors, right. Oh, I'm surprised no one's been in a jury. Okay.
We don't have a jury system.
Yes, we don't have a jury system.
Okay, my apologies.
Only academic juries.
So this is a trial done this year in Australia, right? It's a randomized trial. I'll explain what that is later. Now, jurors were presented the same case, the same defendant, the same witnesses. Everything was the same. But there was 3 differences. Well, 1 difference, but in 3 cases. It was the way the defendant was placed in the courtroom. So in the first instance, the defendant was placed behind a glass cage. You've seen this? Where, presumably so that the defendant doesn't leap over and abuse the judge. In the second instance, he was in a normal dock, so a little wooden barrier around him. And in the third instance, the defendant, the same defendant, was just sitting next to his lawyer in the US style of court. The difference, 60% of people found the defendant guilty when he was in the glass cage, 47% in the open dock, and 36% when he was just sitting next to his lawyer. Everything was the same. And these people are really studying the evidence, really trying to, this was a mock trial, by the way, obviously. Finally, judges. Now, this was an analysis done in 2010 by Israeli economists. And they tried to find whether or not there was any correlation between propensity to be given parole and ethnicity, gender, other socio-demographic characteristics. And there was no correlation. There was, however, this. The y-axis is likelihood to be given parole. Does anyone know what the x-axis is? It's time of day. So just after breakfast, just after lunch, and just after tea, you have a very high chance of being given parole. But just before lunch and just before tea, you have literally no chance of being given parole. These are judges with an average experience of 22.5 years. This analysis was over 1,000 different cases, representing at the time, I think, 40% of all the parole decisions in Israel. But actually, the hypothesis is that we have a finite amount of attention. When that's depleted, we're less able to make decisions. So we just go with the default option, which in this case is to keep the person in prison. So behavioral insights tries to understand these inherent biases. There are certain ways that people will respond to different stimuli, to different situations, and behavioral insights tries to understand it, package it up, and use it to design public policy better. And it's my hypothesis that this will work as well in one country as it will in any other. If you don't recognize them, that's the UK Prime Minister and Deputy Prime Minister, and they were very taken by this agenda. So in 2010, they decided to set up my team. We were part of the Cabinet Office. That's part of central government in the UK. And we've now spun out of government, so we're now independent, but we work with the UK government very closely, and with foreign governments, and with the UNDP, and with the World Bank, and others. And we worked across the broad spectrum of government policy. As I said, whether it's immigration, crime, or health, whatever. And early on, we faced this kind of opposition. There were many newspaper articles and all sorts of commentary about us, which was very negative. Several people asking for us to be sacked. This man set up a blog just to denigrate us. He's a very, very friendly man. Fortunately, more recently, that press attention has become much more positive. And we have a lot of support in the UK and overseas. And one of the reasons for that, I think, has been our ability to demonstrate impact. And this is really what I'm trying to say in this piece. Now, a lot of the time, when governments roll out policies, they've tended to pilot something on a small group of people and said, did this work? OK, let's now scale it up across the country. I actually can't talk very certainly about many other countries, so I'll talk about the UK for risk of offending anyone here. Alternatively, you might roll something out on a small scale, say in Porto, and then say it's an economic incentive package to increase jobs. You roll it out in Porto, and you think, are more people employed? Let's compare it with Lisbon. And more people are employed, so you think, great, it must work. Right? Wrong. The reason you can't do it like that is because your comparison group is not effective. there may be many reasons that Porto is different to Lisbon. It might not be the effect of your intervention. So what we try to do, where possible, is to measure empirically the impact of our interventions by randomized control trials. You guys heard of a randomized control trial? I'm sure a few of you had. Just to make sure everyone's clear, this is what it is. So rather than getting a group and piloting an intervention on a group, or getting two random groups and piloting on one of them and testing what the impact is on the other, you select a sample of people and you do this. You randomly split them into two groups, at least two groups, maybe several groups. And on one group, you don't do anything, or you give them the current policy. And in the other group, you give them the new policy, the behavioral insights policy. Now, the randomization is really important, because if you properly randomly assign the two groups, you can be sure that there's no difference between the two groups. So when you then measure the impact of your policy, be it to reduce crime or to increase jobs or to reduce disease, and you see that there are 3 green men in one group and 4 in the other, because there's no difference between the two groups other than the policy, you can be sure that the effect of your policy is the effect that you're seeing. Make sense? Good. Now, I'm well aware that RCTs aren't the only way to evaluate things properly, and sometimes they're not suitable. But I want to just talk about 3 reasons that they are. And these are 3 common objections that we get when we propose to do RCTs. The first is that it's pointless, because we already know what works. Unfortunately, that's not true. And I'm going to give you an example of why it's not true, such as the pattern of this talk. In the 70s, the United States created something called the Scared Straight program. Now, what this did is it took juveniles, kids who had committed small offenses, and it took them into prisons and made them interact with, hardened prisoners and criminals, and the idea was to scare them into just not committing crime again. Now, that sounds sensible, right? Poetically, it sounds like the right thing to do. And in fact, it was rolled out to 30 jurisdictions. It was rolled out to the UK and several other countries as well. There were a few small-scale studies which showed that it worked. So after 10 years or however many times, 20 people were selected, and it was found that 17 of them weren't criminals, so therefore it must be suitable. But actually, that doesn't make sense at all, because you're not comparing it with anything. You need to compare it with people who didn't have the intervention. Finally, when this was done, when RCTs were carried out, the Campbell Review actually analyzed all the RCTs, a meta-analysis, and it found that not only did this program not have any impact, it actually increased the likelihood of criminality by 68%. So, we don't always know what works. Myth 2, RCTs are expensive. That's not always true either. Actually, if you design an RCT well, it can be done very, very cheaply. Let me give you an example. A colleague of mine in the Behavioural Insights team called Stuart Kettle has been working in Andhra Pradesh in India, and he wanted to test what the impact would be of an automated system of clean water dispensal was. So actually, he was able to design the rollout of this system in such a way that he could robustly evaluate it. So the NGO he was working in weren't able to just roll out the new system across all villages all at once. They had to do it one by one. So by randomizing the rollout, he was able to actually evaluate very robustly what the impact of this new system would be. And what he found was that actually it increased by 25% the access to clean water. And he has much more detailed data as well on what subgroups of people found it most useful as well. Finally, RCTs are unethical. And people say this because you're denying some people access to a new policy. Actually, sometimes they may be unethical, and we need to make sure that there are robust mechanisms in place to assess the nature of the RCT. But as a general rule, I think it's unethical to roll something out with public money without fully knowing what the impact will be. Okay. So, those myths are busted. I'm sure you'll agree. I'm now going to talk about some of the experience that we've had in the Behavioural Insights team, first of all in the UK, and then a couple of our overseas trials as well. First of all, employment. Now, if you ask someone in the Department for Work and Pensions, which looks after employment in the UK, why aren't more people employed? First of all, they'll tell you, actually, we're doing very well now. But secondly, they'll say, well, it's because there aren't enough jobs. Or, well, it's because education isn't good enough. A behavioural approach would say, that may or may not be true. But actually, let's look at the existing system and see what we can do to improve it nonetheless. So let's put all of that to one side. So let's have a look at how the system works in the UK. Let's come on to that. In the UK, when you don't have a job, you go to a job centre. A job centre is part of the infrastructure provided by the state, and they try to find you a job. And typically, you go in, and for statutory reasons, you have to say, I've looked for at least 3 jobs, and then you can qualify for unemployment benefits and various other things. But actually, 3 jobs is too low. And more to the point, looking for a job is quite an obtuse thing to tell someone to do. How can we break the task down into much smaller, simpler tasks and try and link it to a certain time of the day so that when that time of the day occurs, they'll think, oh, I have to do this now. So we came up with this simple form. All it is an opportunity for a job seeker to say, not I will look for a job, but I will complete my CV after Tuesday breakfast. And then the employer signs it, sorry, the job seeker signs it, and the job seeker advisor signs it. The next bar, I will look on this website for various jobs, sign. And you break it down into smaller tasks. What we found was that actually the impact was quite significant. At first, we thought it was 9 percentage points. It then got revised down for statistical reasons to 5 percentage points. That is a very large impact. That's a 10% increase at the cost of a form. We then have the data, that was after 13 weeks, by the way. After 39 weeks, you can see that the effect tails off a little bit, but it's still significant. So we're helping people to get a job. We know they want to get a job anyway. How do we help them get past their tendency to procrastinate? If you're interested, this draws on a discipline called implementation intentions. Economic growth. Now, there are many, many programs, and I'm not going to speak to all of them, but one which is common across the world, and that is to give grant funding to small companies. But how do you measure the effectiveness of a grant given to a small company? Well, typically, you might think, I'll give the grant, and then a year or 2 later, I'll measure whether or not the company is doing better. You might measure their tax returns or employment records. But the problem with that is, the companies who might look for a grant might also be the type of company that will naturally do better because they're forward-looking or for whatever other reason. So how do we find this out? What we've done is the largest randomized control trial of its kind anywhere in the world, where we're randomly assigning people who qualify for the grant to the treatment or the control, i.e. we're randomly having to turn down people for the sake of understanding what works. Now that may seem harsh, but actually in 2 years' time, we'll know exactly what the impact is of each different type of grant. Charitable donations. I like this one just because it's fun. This is a trial to increase payroll giving, so giving, as you receive your salary. This is an email sent round to people asking them to donate money from their salary. 2 conditions. 1, a normal email, well, actually a colored email like this, and 1, the addition of that picture. And that picture is a picture of somebody who already does payroll giving. The difference, people were twice as likely to sign up to donate when the picture was there as when they weren't. A very, very small difference, but a huge impact. Tax. Now, we've talked about one letter already, but this I find fascinating. I hope you do too. But it's such a seemingly inconsequential detail. In this particular letter, people are required to look on a website, the tax office website, download a tax form, send it to the tax office. Why do we make them go to the website where they then have to select the tax form rather than sending them directly to the tax form, which is also online? Very, very small difference. The impact, a significant increase in the number of people who paid the taxes. Just a few characters in a letter sending people directly to the PDF rather than to the website, which they then had to find the PDF on. But we then thought, actually, how do we encourage people to even open the letter to begin with? When you get a letter from the UK tax office, it looks like this. It's in a brown envelope. And everyone knows that it's a tax letter. So they're likely to just put it to one side. I'll deal with that later. As soon as you do that, the likelihood that you're not going to pay goes up. So how do we get them to open it now? What if we send it in a white envelope? But hold on. What if we handwrite a personal message on the outside of the envelope? We had to pay someone to write 5,000 of these. But now we know what the impact is. So, first of all, direct to the link, direct to the form, we increase a little bit more. And then plus the letter in the white envelope, and we see a significant increase. The key question here is, could this approach work in other cultures? Yes, obviously. We were asked to think about tax compliance in Guatemala. Now, Guatemala is a country where people are much less likely to pay their taxes than in the UK. So tax revenue as a proportion of GDP is only 12%. That's one of the lowest in the world. So we looked at this project. We worked with the World Bank, with the Guatemalan Tax Authority. And I guess you can tell by the fact that we're all smiling that we had a good impact. The same sort of approach. The first trial that we did was with letters. And lots of different types of behavioural interventions within the letters. We saw a very similar pattern to the designs that we had in the UK. But what's really interesting about in Guatemala is that unlike the UK, we actually saw an even more profound impact of businesses. So the bars at the back is the increase that we had on the compliance of businesses. And we found that the most effective letter brought in 20 times the amount of tax as what it cost to send the letter. So if the first trial was about increasing the amount of people paying their tax, the frequency, the number, this trial is about increasing the average amount that people declare. So there's a website in Guatemala called Declarawate, where 95% of people who pay their tax use to download the form to pay their taxes on. Now, when you go to this website, you pass a CAPTCHA. Do you guys know what a CAPTCHA is? It's that little mechanism to make sure that you're not a machine. So we've tried to put different messages in the CAPTCHA. So this one, your Spanish is probably better than mine, but it says, what kind of person are you? You have to click one of the boxes. I'm an honest taxpayer who always declares truthfully. Or I'm a really busy taxpayer and I don't really have time for this. We've got 800,000 people in this trial. Over the course of 4 months, we'll be observing 3.2 million data points. And we'll be able to tell, actually, what is the effect on the average amount of declarations that each of these messages have. The last one I'm going to tell you about is a trial that we're working on with UNDP and my excellent colleague Alex Opronenko. Moldova has high documented levels of tuberculosis and multi-drug resistant tuberculosis. These are the amount of pills that you have to take every day if you have TB. Now, one of the problems I'm told they face is that people don't finish their courses. They don't take all their medicine. the germs aren't completely killed, they come back stronger, and then they're in big trouble. So what can we do to encourage adherence, medical adherence? In Moldova, they operate DOT, directly observed therapy, which the World Health Organization agrees is an excellent thing to do. It requires a patient to be observed every day when they take their medicine by a doctor. But the way it's done in Moldova requires the patient to go to a TB cabinet and be observed every day. Now, for some people, that's probably very good. But for some people, how can you hold down a job if you're doing that? Actually, there's a lot of stigma attached to having TB. So I don't want my friends or other people to see me going to this TB cabinet. And also, it's just annoying. I've got to go every day somewhere. So what we're doing is we're trialing VOT, virtually observed treatment, where once a month patients will go collect a batch of drugs, and then they'll be observed over Skype every day taking their medicine. The same incentives will apply to them. And in about a year's time, I should be able to tell you what the results were. The outcome measures are not only medical adherence, but also quality of life, cost. So, in conclusion, small changes can be really, really powerful. And actually, they can be more likely to happen because it's easier, really, to convince a policymaker to make a small change than to completely reform their agenda. But what's critical is context. So we have to robustly trial everything to understand what is the nature of our impacts. Then we will have the evidence required to scale up or adapt as necessary. Now, I hope that provokes a lot of questions, and I look forward to answering them. Thanks very much. Thanks again.